your flesh and blood.
Welcome to Tell Me Your Story. New paradigms for a new world where we're giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here 9 times a week. Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., Wednesdays at 9 a.m., and Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 a.m., streaming live at all those times at richarddugan.com. We are on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, as well as YouTube, where you can watch these conversations. I hope that you will take time to subscribe and click notifications so that when a new conversation is posted, you'll be notified and you'll be able to tune in, listen in, and learn, and be entertained and inspired. A reminder that Choices, which is my book, 5 Steps for Life, it's available on Amazon.com in paperback, hardcover, and Kindle with Audible, soon to be released. We also ask that if you can support the work that we are doing financially, we do have a PayPal account. It is there for your security as well as ours. And when they ask for an email address to whom you're sending, please go to richard@richarddugan.com. That's the email address. If you go to richarddugan.com, there is also a link directly to PayPal so that you can send us whatever support you can. And we thank you to those who have helped and to those who will help. We also ask that you take time during this decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, to go within to that quiet, peaceful, calm, still place and listen to that still, small voice. And with that, we now take you to our very special interview and guest here on Tell Me Your Story. And
okay, we're off.
And welcome to Tell Me Your Story. I am Richard Dugan, along with my very special guest, and his name is John Sanbonmatsu. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you for being with us. We have a very interesting program ahead of us.
Well, thanks for having me, Richard. I'm delighted to be here.
You have a book. It's entitled The Omnivore's Deception: What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and Ourselves. And obviously, this is a book that is fascinating for folks to pick up, and they can go to your website, of course, which we will be linked to. John Sanbonmatsu.com is the website, and I'll spell that out for you: JohnSanbonmatsu.com. And as I say, we'll be linked to that. What is it that we got wrong? I mean, I thought we knew everything. We're so intelligent. We're so smart. We're at the top of the food chain and everything. And you're telling us we got it wrong?
I know. Spoiler alert. Yeah. Yeah, big time. Big time. I mean, none of the art. Look, I should explain. I've been studying this issue of how we relate to other animals, the ethics of that. I'm a professor of philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, and one of the courses I teach is ethics. And in decades of research, I've found there's no good argument for what we're doing to the other species of this planet. And it's an odd paradox in a way that the system of animal agriculture, fishing industry, not to mention, animal experimentation in laboratories and so on and so forth, that this is all out in the open to some extent, and yet it's hiding in plain sight, and people don't even think about it. I'll tell you, when I started working on this book maybe 12 years ago, and during that whole period, when people say, "What are you working on?" I'd say, "Well, I'm writing this book about our mass violence against animals," and they would get the most perplexed look. Like, what do you mean? They'd say, "Do you mean like dog abuse?" And I'd say, "No, mostly the animal food economy. We're killing about 80 billion land animals every single year. That's birds and mammals mostly, and then up to 2.7 trillion marine animals every single year. I mean, the violence, the suffering, the horror of it is indescribable, and I describe it in my book as radical evil. That is what we're getting wrong. We don't understand that this issue of meat, which people think is so trivial, and if anyone describes themselves or identifies themselves as a vegan, people get really upset about that. They feel very threatened. and they see veganism as a threat to, masculinity and all these things. Well, it's the most important issue of our time, I argue in my book. And I think if people, read it with an open mind, they can end up mostly agreeing with me.
Okay. And the main message, and again, I've lived on this planet for 65 years and consumed all kinds of different things and not consumed some things that I'm thinking, I don't think I want to go down that road. But it isn't just the consumption. I know that. It is also just the mistreatment. I find it fascinating, and I'll share this with you as I have shared on this program before. As of this conversation, we had to lay to rest one of our dogs. Had a hip dysplasia, and at the age that he was at, 13, it was time, and we didn't want him to suffer any more than he already had. And we love him dearly, but we love him more enough to let him go. And I find it fascinating that we're unwilling to do the same thing for human beings. It's like, as long as you aren't, as the definition goes, you're not suicidal. You're not wanting to off yourself per se. But at the same time, what if it's someone who's, let's say, I don't know, 94, 95, maybe their health is declining, but they come up with this phrase, and I did hear this from one of my guests who was taking care of a 94-year-old woman. The 94-year-old woman says, "I'm done. I've done everything I want to do in this life. I want to go." And there was an element of facilitation for that process. And I also hear too, here I'm on the south coast of Santa Barbara. I'm at Santa Barbara on the south coast. Fishing abounds, obviously. They say that fish do not have the same kind of nerve endings and such that humans do when the hook goes in. And even if you do catch and release, there's no pain. That's what they say. And I'm thinking, how do you know? I
Yeah.
don't know that there's been sufficient study per se. Can you talk to, because that's one of the aspects of all of this is that we don't really understand the other creatures on the planet to the level where we can make those kinds of statements.
Thank you for that. Let me just briefly respond to what you said about euthanasia. I'm very sorry about your dog, and I think that the fact that you had such a close emotional connection to your dog, and you understood that your dog was an individual with his or her own personality and quirks and affection, capacity for love, right? It shows that you had a window into the consciousness of this other being, and you could tell
Mm,
when your dog was upset or depressed or you know, um, and we can know that about sheep and chickens and cows and so forth as well, that we just don't pay any attention to them, but they're no less cognitively sophisticated or emotionally complex than our own
right.
cats and dogs,
Hmm.
right? And in my book, by the way, I talk about euthanasia and the Nazi euthanasia program, and the relevance for my argument, right, is that we have this idea that we can raise and kill animals, quote unquote, humanely, and quote euthanize them. But you're talking about young animals in the prime of life who are brutally killed. You can't kill another being generously or humanely, except under extremely rare conditions where, in your case, it was a relation of true love and respect. Because you said that you ended your dog's life for the dog, not for
Hmm.
your own convenience.
Exactly.
Um, Now I forgot your second.
Having to
What
do
was your
with
other?
using the example of fishing and the
Oh
hooks
yeah,
or
yeah,
no
fishing. Yeah,
nerves.
no, thank.
And
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
do we really know enough to make those kinds of statements that no, there are no nerve endings, they don't feel pain?
It's ridiculous, and it's true that there hasn't been enough research on this topic. But I mean, look, fish have been on this planet before we have.
Mm,
Okay, mammals, and they are exquisitely adapted to their surrounding worlds. They have there's no science has established they're intelligent. They have emotions. How could they not feel pain? I mean, if you can't go through the world feeling pain, like people who had leprosy, right? I guess they still do. That was a big problem in past centuries. They would lose their limbs partly because they would get a cut and not know it and get infected. And I mean, you can't survive without being able to have basic feelings. And then similarly, by the way, when people throw a live lobster into a pot of boiling water, and they think that the lobster doesn't feel anything, it's That animal is being tortured alive. I mean, these are animals who are so sensitive. They've got millions of nerve endings all over their bodies. Their sense of smell is something like, I don't know, a million times more acute than our sense of smell.
Mm.
So I think it's here's the thing. I mean, we always err on the side against the animals. You know what I'm saying? Like in the case of fish, there are debates in science about, what fish know, how they experience things. Oh, by the way, there's an excellent book I want to recommend called What a Fish Knows
Ah,
by by a scientist, a biologist named Jonathan Balcombe.
mm,
What a Fish Knows. If you're interested in the science on this stuff, I really, and not you and your listeners,
right.
I recommend that. So look, the fact is we don't need to engage in this mass violence like at all. I mean, all the science shows that a plant-based or vegan diet is actually better for humans generally than any kind of animal-based one. I mean, vegans have lower rates of stroke, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes. Oh, I mentioned that. They even live longer. Now, but that is not the argument of my book. I'm not saying people should become vegan and give up the animal economy because it's good for them, because it is good for them. And actually, also we gain from the fact that 75% of all emerging diseases are zoonotic in origin. In other words,
Mm.
most of the diseases we get, including H5N1, the virus that causes avian flu, come from our exploitation of animals one way or another.
Mhm.
But that isn't my argument. My argument is that first of all, it's simply wrong to commit acts of extreme violence against defenseless, sensitive beings. But also, there's a better way to be human on this planet. Uh, we don't have to be the demon of the earth. We could be the enlightened species that shows compassion and care for our neighbors instead of terrorizing them.
Well, what's interesting is there was a scientist back in the 30s by the name of Jagadish Chandra Bose, and he created or developed or invented a device called a crescograph. It's the equivalent of the blood pressure cuff for humans. And he did some experiments briefly. And by the way, this story is in the book Autobiography of a Yogi, where he took a cloth with chloroform and with the plant hooked up to the crescograph, he could watch the decline in, shall we say, the turgor pressure within the leaves and what have you of the plant when he moved the chloroform close to the plant. Then when he moved it away, the turgor pressure went up and he went back again. And what he was proving was that plants are aware of their surroundings, which means there's a certain level of consciousness. So, what this raises is the fact that these are potentially, I don't know this for a fact, but potentially living, sentient beings, if you will, or creatures. So the question takes it, and I say this somewhat facetiously. So now what are you going to eat? Because there's nothing left to eat unless you want to eat rocks and dirt and so forth and so on. There was a wonderful Barney Miller episode where they got a guy. He was in the cell and he was inhaling greatly. And the one guy says to him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm eating." He says, "What are you talking about?" "Oh, I'm a breatharian." Hey,
Ha
and of
ha ha
course the
ha.
comic line was, "Hey, we'll save some for the rest of us." But everything is living. Everything has energy. And so it's like, and then there's another woman by the name of, yeah, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Temple Grandin.
Yes, I
And
go at great length.
yeah,
I critique her. Yeah.
my wife and I got to meet her when she was here in Santa Barbara promoting her work. And we saw the movie, obviously. And one of the things that was fascinating to me was when she was in the slaughterhouse. And the question after the cattle were, the one cow was dead, or what have you, steer, where'd it go? Where'd it go? And then, of course, the guy doesn't understand the question. He says, well, just a moment ago it was alive, and now it's not. Where did it go? So she was connected not to the physical body of the cow, but to that aspect of it that animates it, just like the aspect that animates you and that animates me. So I have to wonder if there is even a humane way to do this if we're going to continue down this path as omnivores, or if we are, because I know a lot of people are they're making that transition to the plants. Uh, you know, and Bose's scientific research and study notwithstanding, we've got to eat something. There's got to be something for us to keep our physical bodies going. And I will just add one more thing. I've watched hunters on different programs, and they will shoot their prey, and then they will go over, and I've seen this time and time again, where they will, in essence, pray and thank the animal and the universe, if you will, their God, for this bounty that will help to feed their family. Now, I'm not saying that was necessarily humane, but they are at least showing some level of respect for what is on the planet. Can you talk a little bit about these
Let,
aspects?
Yes, thank you so much. These are great questions. Let me begin with the last one first. You can't love what you seek to destroy, and you can't respect another being if you're trying to kill it. Period, full stop.
Okay.
None of those people hunt these animals because they'll die otherwise. These are the same people who have cell phones and they go to movies, and even if they're working class, it's a sadistic pleasure they take in committing an act of extreme violence against a completely defenseless being. That is why they hunt. Period. In terms of plants, I think it's fascinating the science, what science is discovering about plants. And in fact, when I was in junior high school, by the way, which is when Barney Miller was airing. Those of you who've never seen the Barney Miller show should check that out. It's really funny. Um, I did this plant experiment with Venus flytrap plants, where I talked to them. And because there was this popular book called The Secret Life of Plants, a big
Yeah.
bestseller that came out that suggested that plants are
Yeah.
conscious. And,
Hmm.
so I had one group of plants I talked to and the one I didn't encourage. And the results were not clear because everybody died. All the plants died in my experiment. But look, there's no evidence that plants are conscious. There just is no firm scientific evidence. Now, should we be open to that possibility? Sure. But here's what we do know. We know that complex animals, and I also include insects in this, do have consciousness. What does that mean? It means they have a subjective point of view. It means that they are capable of suffering, that they have individual personalities, that they have memories, that they're capable of trauma, suffering PTSD, for example. This has been scientifically proven.
Hmm.
That they're capable of relating to others, being fearful, being joyous. One cannot compare a chicken, say, and there's a Scientific American article one can look up on this on intelligence and emotions in chickens.
Hmm.
One cannot compare a chicken to a plant. It's what in philosophy we call a category mistake. We're
Mm.
talking about consciousnesses that have been on this earth for millions and millions of years. And again, I'm open to the idea that we have to think about plants. However, a vegan diet would kill if one is concerned about plants, right? Most of the Earth's surface is given over to animal agriculture, and it's the most inefficient way to produce protein or calories for human consumption because you just need massive amounts of resources to feed a cow or a pig and then kill the animals. So they're consuming more plants than is necessary. So we would reduce them, even if we were concerned about plants, we'd reduce by orders of magnitude the number of plants we were consuming by going vegan, actually. And finally, Temple Grandin, I think, is a very sinister person, and I talk about her at length. I mean, she's an advocate of using gas chambers for animals, and very enthusiastic, putting pigs in gas chambers, chickens in gas chambers, and this is something that is already happening even on organic farms. And we know that you can't put a mammal or a bird in a gas chamber without causing them horrific suffering. The thing about Grandin is she spent her entire career helping animals go uncomplainingly to their doom. And to me, that is a symptom of a sick society. That there's as you said, there's a Hollywood biopic about her with Claire Danes, this temple called Temple. There's this worshipful attitude towards this person. Let me repeat that, whose entire life has been devoted to the mass killing of other beings on this earth and who wants them to be able to go uncomplainingly to their doom. Her whole shtick is to keep them from knowing that they're about to be killed.
Hmm.
Frankly, they have a right to know that. Um, and I think, if again, if people read my book with an open mind and they see through the arguments or read through the arguments, they'll see that this system is insane. It's insane that we think that there's any justification at all for these kinds of behaviors.
Hmm. It seems to me that in order to make this transition from the old paradigm to the new, which is what we're promoting, new paradigms for a new world, we have to take a different perspective, almost to the degree, and I know people will think this is ludicrous, that my wife and I took towards not just our our recent dog, who we and I use the term we set him free. All right, now in deference to Bernie Siegel, who I've had on this program, we were chatting about the loss of his wife, and I made the comment. So, have you ever had any connection or communication with your wife since she transitioned? And he says, "What do you mean transition? She didn't transition. She died. She died. Oh, why can't we use the word die?" And that's so I say, "Okay, all right, Bernie, I understand what you're saying," and I appreciated what he was saying. But we've had to do the same thing. We've had four, five, six, seven. I think we've had 7 or 8 dogs. Right now, we have none. And my wife and I have been together for 26, 27 years. And that's just part of the natural process because they don't live as long as humans. And so we were as kind to them as we were to Angus. He's the latest. And we were the same way with the cats that we had. We at one time had 9, and then we were down to 0, and now we're back up to 3, and so forth. And we know it's like that's part of the package. All right. You don't get an animal and get out of the end, unless you want to bring in hospice or something like that. Um, but it seems to me that that is one of the things we have to do in order to change the paradigm, in order to move. We have to recognize the animals that are here on this planet with us, almost with having that personal connection. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I've had cats before. I don't at the moment, and the grief I experienced with their loss was no less intense than the grief I've felt for the loss of family members. Okay, and Hallmark, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, began actually producing sympathy cards for people who've lost their companion animals because it was this unrecognized or unacknowledged grief. And I think that we can learn something really important. There's something profound about seeing a loved one, even a non-human, quote, even a non-human die, right? It's profound.
Yeah.
And so, but we can juxtapose that insight into the gravity of death, whether you believe in an afterlife or not, right? And then our callous, sadistic views and treatment of these billions and billions and in fact trillions of other animals who are again no different than our cats and dogs. I wish that there was In fact, I think there may be in some places hospice for companion animals because I've been on both sides of that delicate calculation of, well, are you waiting too long to euthanize, a very ill cat or dog,
Mm.
or you're doing it too soon? And I'll tell you, I could do a talk for an hour about the time that we euthanized a cat, and I felt that he was not ready, and it felt like murder to me. It really and truly felt like a betrayal. Um, and if we're going to give hospice to our human family members, I don't see why we can't do that. Give a dignified death, to other animals that
Yeah.
we live with. But again, when you're talking about that kind of killing, that kind of the taking of life, that if that's grounded, as I said, in love and respect, that's one kind of thing. But if you're like Temple Grandin, creating this myth that you can kill humanely and with respect, it's a completely different thing. The only reason those animals are being killed at a fraction of their natural lives, right? Chickens and pigs and sheep and so
Yeah.
forth, is to create profit for the animal food industry. Like literally, that is the only reason that a corporation exists under the law, to produce
Yeah.
profit for its owners and shareholders. That's it.
Yeah.
Um, so, so what I call for in the book is a new way of addressing, let's say, approaching the other beings of the planet with
Mhm.
one of true reciprocity, curiosity, nonviolence. I mean, take fish. People, divers, it's really interesting. Divers have formed relationships, friendships that have lasted years with specific fish.
I've
I
seen.
understand there's a
Yeah.
film coming out about a diver's relationship with a manta ray, for example. Octopuses, you may have heard of the Netflix film My Octopus Teacher,
Seen it.
you
Seen it.
know. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I know, I have a friend who saw it and she said, "Oh, well, I'm never going to eat an octopus again." I was crying during the movie. But, those kinds of films are very misleading because we think that there are like two classes of animals. There are the smart ones like primates and crows and dolphins and octopuses have been added to that pantheon, right? And then everyone else is stupid and inferior. Is just completely not true. Scientists have blown that out of the water. Uh, like think of a mollusk. Do you think of mollusks as super intelligent? Maybe you don't. A mollusk, right? Shellfish but an octopus is a mollusk,
Yeah.
actually. So we need a broader perspective
Yeah.
and more humility,
Yeah.
really.
And of course, my question is, how in the world do you test for intelligence? How do you do that with creatures that we can't consciously communicate with, or at least it does not seem that we could consciously communicate?
But we communicate with them all the time. I mean, you lived with your dog. Your dog let you know when he or she wanted to go out. The
Yeah.
cat's the same, and when they want affection, they come to you. If they're not interested, "Hey, here, Joey." Joey like turns her back on you, like So now that's a simple
Right.
communication. But scientists have done many experiments, not all of them ethical, many of them unethical, to be
Mm.
honest. But where they have elaborate ways of testing for experiment for intelligence in other animals. If you go to my website, johnsanbonmatsu.com, and you look for my book, The Omnivore's Deception, there are videos I've linked to where uh, you can see the intelligence of other animals, whether in raw footage or scientific experiments. For example, Dr. Irene Pepperberg worked with this parrot named Alex, a gray African parrot, and you could ask Alex a question, and he would answer you in English. So what Pepperberg would do is she'd like show Alex a tray of different small objects, and she'd say, she'd pick one up and say, "What color? What color?" And he would say, "Yellow." Or "What matter?" And he'd say, "Wool." And and then he'd say, like, "Well, can I go back now?" Like to my cage. That is one example.
Mm.
Now the problem is, and you're right, like these are creatures who evolved over the course of millions of years. Some of them, like birds, they split off from us,
Hmm.
60 million years ago, and yet we can communicate with them, but we'll never know completely what it's like to be a bat or a bird. We have to recognize that as mammals, we're limited. So, as ingenious as these scientific experiments are, there are always going to be limits because in a way, we're testing animals on human intelligence,
Yeah.
which isn't fair, right? I mean, what if an orca was trying to experiment with us about orca intelligence or honeybee? By the
Yeah.
way, bees, for example, let me give you an example. There's studies of bees who, gosh, were they bumblebees? Maybe they were bumblebees. I apologize to the bee community. Uh, the scientists trained these bees to roll a ball into a little goal, and then they would get rewarded. Now, in the, I think, 130 million years that there have been bees on the planet, it's either 30 million or 130 million years, no bee has ever rolled a ball. Okay, that is not something that they do in nature.
Hmm.
Not only did they learn to do that, but they learned almost instantly watching other bees do it, and they improved on the technique that the researchers had taught them in these very creative, spontaneous ways. So you can look at that, and you have to conclude that insects are not just machines, right, enacting some kind of DNA script. they're individuals and they have intelligence, and we can actually see it in action. But again, there will always be limits to what we can know.
Yeah. John Sanbonmatsu. I'm working on getting that name right. Sanbonmatsu. John is with us here on the program. We're talking about his latest work, having to do with the title being The Omnivore's Deception, as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, Reverend Dr. D, and we're talking with John Sanbonmatsu, and we're talking about basically, and I'm going to put it from this context because of your area of expertise, philosophy, from a philosophical as well as ethical and or moral perspective. I want to ask you, pardon me, about this aspect of um, the soul thereof animals. Now, there are those who do not believe, for example, that animals, dogs and cats, are children, go to quote unquote heaven. All right. Now, that's just if you're a one who believes in that particular philosophy of heaven and hell. My wife and I firmly disagree. We do believe they have a soul. I don't know whether they go to heaven or hell. All I know is that I want to believe that they will be somewhere that we will be able to connect with them in the next life. Not so much reincarnation in terms of incarnating into a new human life, but in terms of the spiritual world. And one of the things I've asked on many programs dealing with a lot of different subjects has to do with, for example, the soul of a country. I mean, we could talk about the soul of you or the soul of me, and so forth. But I have to wonder, when we're doing these kinds of, as you would put it, horrific things to the creatures of this planet, um, that has to have some kind of impact on the soul of, and you can take it to from the individual on up. Have you uh, talked a lot? Have you talked much about this aspect of the? And I don't necessarily want to get into the karmic conversation, but in terms of, I've even asked this question of this country by someone: Is the soul of America healthy? Is the soul of America okay, or does the soul of America, just like my soul, my body, mind, soul, and spirit, emotions, and so forth, need to be I need to, to work on that. I need to fix some things, work on some traumas, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious about the spiritual aspects of all of this, John.
Mm, really interesting. I mean, I think the way you're using soul there, the term is undergoing a little equivocation, by which I mean to say it's meaning one thing in one context and another in another. And it's a perfectly valid word for those purposes, but we have to be clear these are different things, right? Whether, as you were saying, there's a metaphysical essence that inheres in the human being, maybe other species, right, that survives death, for example. That's different from talking about the character of the United States, which is indeed languishing. um, so let me answer this in a couple of different ways. First of all, I do argue that using the soul in a kind of metaphorical way, that
Mm-hmm.
what we're doing to other animals is damaging our own souls. As to say,
Hmm.
it's ruining our own character, both as individuals and as a species. We can't keep enacting this evil over and over and over again, and affirming it without being evil ourselves. Um, Regarding the soul, the question, like more metaphysically, whether humans are the only beings with souls, if we have souls. I just want to note, do I talk about this? Maybe a little bit in my book. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher 2,500 years ago, distinguished between three kinds of souls. Okay, there were plant souls, he argued, there were non-human animal souls, and then there were human souls. And he argued that only humans had this kind of higher reason. Um, but it was interesting that Aristotle nonetheless recognized that other living beings have something going on with them that isn't simply like a rock or something like that, inanimate nature.
Mm-hmm.
In my view, I personally am skeptical of life after death. That's my personal view, but it doesn't feature in my work, you know. But what I like about the idea of the soul with all animals, all sentient beings, is I think of the soul as consciousness. Now,
Right.
whether that consciousness survives death, that's maybe a different question. No one
Hmm.
has come back to tell us, and there isn't any science about it, really. But um, certainly, if you look into the eyes of your dog, as you had, you know,
Hmm.
you see there's someone there, and that someone we can call a soul, in my view. You know,
Hmm.
that if you take the time, if we take the time to really peer into the eyes of another being, another conscious being, we see that there's someone home there. There's a someone, not a something. That that to me is a good enough definition of the soul. And again, whether the soul survives death or not, to me is kind of immaterial because this is the life that we're living.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and you know, we have an injunction in many religious traditions and moral philosophies to treat others with a kind of basic respect.
Yeah, and obviously that is something that is certainly missing. We're not even treating ourselves and one another with common courtesy and respect and or kindness in this world. And we put up those walls or those shields, as I like to call them, and we can fire the ammo, the calling of names and all of this kind of stuff, but nothing gets in. And it reminds me of James Redfield's Celestine Prophecy, where he talks about how we are all here, speaking of the fact that we are here, and this is the reality that we need to deal with, and that we have messages for each other. Sort of, we're working on our puzzle, so to speak. We're trying to put together and understand the bigger picture of the universe. And the only way we're going to do that is if we put down the shields and allow the messages to come in. And whether I agree or disagree with where John is coming from, or he agrees or disagrees where I'm coming from, we're both open to the conversation. It's a dialogue. It's not a debate. It's not he's wrong and I'm right, or he's right and I'm wrong. We have got to start working on that process. And that's one of the things that I really liked about John's about James' book in that regard. And it's part of what this program is about as well, in terms of sharing with people choices and knowledge of those choices to help make their dreams come true. And if you want a better world, well, I want to talk to you, John, about some of those things that we can do to make this a better world as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan along with John Sanbonmatsu, and we are talking about his latest work, as I've mentioned before, The Omnivore's Deception. And it's a fascinating read. You're going to want to get a copy by going to his website, which we will be linked to. John, what about that in terms of what I mentioned just a moment ago, in this aspect of even being able to make some changes in this current paradigm that we're talking about? Um, have there been some inroads in this process of, shall we say, encouraging through thoughtful dialogue ways in which, and we'll keep it to the waters, that the fishermen in general are beginning to understand, and some of them are maybe doing different practices, or maybe they're finding, I don't know, another line of work rather than pulling the creatures out of the water.
There's a gosh, Renee's going to kill me. I always butcher her last name. Renee Sodden. Oh my goodness. Let me just refer folks to Rowdy Girls Sanctuary
Okay.
in Texas. And Renee was the wife of a cattle rancher, and she and her husband, took good care in their case of the cows that they were raising for slaughter. But Renee began to understand these were individuals and that they were being sent to their deaths, and she objected to her husband that if he were to sell this next batch of calves or cows to the slaughterhouse, she would go out and buy them and bring them back. and she and she did. And he finally relented. And what they did is they closed down the ranching operation, turned it into an animal sanctuary, and they're both vegan advocates. And so, in fact, it is possible to have that kind of, as you called it, a paradigm shift. But I want to be clear that what I'm arguing in my book is indeed for a paradigm shift, but it's also talking about a new form of civilization. And dialogue and discussion is part of that, getting there to a different way of being with one another and the other beings of this planet. But to be honest, any social progress that's ever been made over the last 2 centuries has been as a result of struggle, of conflict, struggle over the narrative, struggle over power.
Mm.
I mean, Martin Luther King, of course, now we have a holiday and he's been very tamed in a certain sense, in our narratives. But remember, he was the most widely hated man in America by whites, right, for years.
Mm.
And his nonviolent technique, which he developed out of Gandhi and, having read Gandhi carefully, and the idea of speaking truth to power, satyagraha. King writes from Birmingham jail in his famous letter from Birmingham jail that the white clergy in the South were saying, you're going too fast and you shouldn't make people uncomfortable and you shouldn't create conflict. You're creating tension. And he says in that letter, well, yeah, we're creating what he called creative tension. We're 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 struggling against this brutal system in an uncompromising way, but in a spirit of generosity and love as Christians, because he was Christian, of course, he
Mhm.
and the Southern Christian Leadership Council or Committee. So this is a struggle for in defense of the earth, because this animal economy is literally undermining the conditions for all life on Earth. We're in the middle of the worst mass species extinction event in 65 million years. And that is a result of the animal food economy. Even global warming, the animal system causes more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector, cars, trucks, planes,
Mm.
ships, and so on. So, and those are just two examples. Those are the big ones. But yeah, we need to have a complete 180-degree turn. We can see ourselves as on the Titanic, steaming towards that iceberg, and we have seconds left to turn this ocean liner just enough, a fraction of a degree, so that by the time we get to the iceberg, we aren't completely doomed. But to be honest, I think it may be too late. Even if that were true, existentially speaking, self respect requires us to do everything we can to prevent the further catastrophe and the further suffering. So that may be a sobering message, but I don't believe in dealing in platitudes when it comes to these things. I think that we face enormous odds,
Yeah.
not just in the animal advocacy movement, but anyone who's concerned about equality and democracy in this country or other countries. We are in a fascist state, or very close to a fascist state, and it's only going to get worse from here. And same with the ecological crisis. We're on the brink of total ecological collapse on the earth, and people don't realize that. We're talking about total collapse of this ecological system, which sustains our lives, our species.
Yeah. And again, if we make the changes that are necessary, maybe we can avert disaster. Here's what's interesting too, because you chose to use the analogy of the Titanic. Here's the funny thing. Well, funny, bizarre. I saw a documentary just a couple of days ago that now implies that the sinking wasn't an accident. It was intentional by the powers that be because they wanted to undermine that particular shipping company, as well as get rid of a few of the highfalutin one percenters, as we call them today, among other things, because there were certain things that were done to that ship that made it less than seaworthy, that it was actually already broken before it set sail. And they knew, and they let it set sail. And that's, I thought, wow, okay. So it's going to be interesting to see what history reveals to us as we move forward into the future in these kinds of stories. To me, that was like fascinating. I mean, it doesn't affect my life directly because that was over 100 years ago, but still, it's like, and what else has happened intentionally, that has caused great harm and so forth and so on. But that's a story for another day. But I just thought it was an interesting parallel to your analogy of the Titanic. Um, we have so much on this planet. It's such a beautiful place overall. Okay, overall, it's a beautiful place. Do you think that, like many people have said, we've crossed the tipping point we're doomed, or do you think there's still hope?
Thank you. Let me say I'm unaware of that documentary. Maybe you can send me the link to that because I haven't heard anything about that in the press, which is strange. But um, to stick with the Titanic for a moment, when the
Hmm.
iceberg, when the ship, whatever caused it, I think it was an iceberg, but whatever caused it to start sinking, it was sinking, and people had a choice about what they were going to do in those last moments. And I was always struck by the fact, uh, like in the film, there's a great film called A Night to Remember from the 1930s. It's a very accurate depiction of the sinking of the Titanic. And both in the film and the historical record, I found it fascinating that these musicians on board who had been hired, to entertain the guests, they were there on the deck, this little like string quartet,
Hmm.
performing as people were screaming and rushing to the lifeboats. They were doing that to calm people, and they went down with the ship. Even if it's true that we're past the tipping point, how do you want to be in your, how should we be as a species in our last years or centuries, if we're lucky? Are we going to continue to brutalize and terrorize and murder all the other beings and one another, by the way?
Yeah.
Or are we going to show compassion and help people as they go down? So again, I feel it's almost a moot point. I'm very pessimistic about things, but it doesn't get us off the hook,
No.
right? Because we first of all we can't know. I'm not a prophet. You're not a prophet. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know enough to know that this is a catastrophe that's unfolding before our eyes, and we know that inaction. We know where that leads
Hmm.
to everything getting worse. And as beings with empathy, and I talk a lot about empathy in my book,
Hmm.
as beings with empathy, we can and must open ourselves, open our heart to others. Like right now, Gaza, you know, there's a genocide occurring in Gaza. You're talking about over 2 million people who are being starved to death. It isn't enough to just feel bad about it, right?
Yeah.
Empathy without action is meaningless. This is the core of moral philosophy, right?
Hmm.
If I think I'm a good person because in theory, oh, if only I could get that humane meat I hear about, then in my heart of hearts, I don't want the animals to suffer, but I'm still going to go to McDonald's. Well, in fact, that humane meat, as I show in my book, is a myth. There's no good way to exploit and kill other animals. Just isn't.
Yeah.
So we need to come to terms with that. And these are hard truths. But honestly, I think that we can get to the other side.
Hmm.
And, if you look at Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech, he says,
Oh
I may
yeah.
not get there with you, but, I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the other side. And what he means is he's seen a world of justice. Justice is something we can imagine in our minds. So when people say to me, oh, well, it's impossible for everyone to become vegan. Well, yeah, if you keep saying that.
Yeah.
But if you imagine a world where we're treating the other beings differently, we can at least get closer to that world on the other side, you know.
Yeah. Well, I know too that some of these elements within the animal industry are starting to recognize because their product, if you will, is not being consumed. And so in other words, the market won't bear what they're putting out there, and it all goes to waste. And so now they're being, hey, don't grow as many this season or what have you, or this period of time, and on and on. And I know that's happening. And by the way, we also have chickens, but they're not eating chickens. We gather up their eggs. And if we have scraps of vegetables and those kinds of things that they can eat, then we give them to the chickens so that we get it back, so to speak, through the egg production. But I'm curious about that from the standpoint of those who are, like yourself, concerned
Hmm.
about the care and so forth of other creatures that produce a byproduct, i.e., the bees' honey, cow's milk, chickens' eggs, and so forth. What is your feeling in that regard? I mean, we have a secure, protected chicken run with a chicken coop inside where predators cannot get in. And I go in and I freshen up their water. I give them fresh food every day and collect the eggs. And there are those who say, no, that is slavery. That is, and the bees the same thing. And it's like, again, we're coming back to that same argument. So what am I going to eat? That kind of thing. And I'm
Well,
not asking the question. I'm saying, what are your thoughts
yeah.
in those byproducts that are being produced?
Yeah. Well, first of all, in terms of what there is to eat, next year I'll have been vegan for 40 years. And those of you who are seeing this rather than hearing this, I don't think I look like I'm 63.
You're looking good,
So
buddy. You're looking good.
thank you. Thank you. So there's a zillion things to eat, like literally limitless things to eat other than animal products, including eggs. And I actually wrote an op-ed about this, about the fact that the thing that people were upset about avian flu, right, was
Hmm.
that egg prices were going up. They didn't care about the millions of animal chickens who were being
Slaughtered.
suffocated to death and yeah, and gassed and we just don't need the eggs, actually. And I think, you mentioned slavery, and I know people hear that if someone says, oh, some advocate of animals says, it's like slavery, people go ballistic and think that's kind of crazy. But actually, human slavery was based on what we call now animal domestication. And during the Neolithic period, 10, 11,000 years ago, that's when
Hmm.
animals began to be kept and controlled and reproduced for their labor and their bodies for humans to exploit. And then when human slavery develops, a few thousand years later, it's based on some of the same techniques, like to keep animals from escaping their enclosures, they would be hobbled. So human slaves become hobbled if they try to escape. The same ideologies of a master over a subordinate being, the idea that's natural to dominate others, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole history which I go into in my book about this. Um, there's an animal sanctuary in Massachusetts, and I visited it once, and this was another case of two farmers who decided they were raising sheep, and that's in the lambs to slaughter, and then one day they realized with horror what they were doing, because they loved these animals that they were raising and did as well as they could by them. And they got rid of their farm and they created an animal sanctuary. But at any rate, Sherry, who runs the place with her husband, was saying, I said, well, what do you do with the eggs of the chickens? Do you use the eggs? And she said, no, we throw them out. And I said, really? Why? It seems like a waste. And she explained that, if she begins to see the chickens as something that are there to produce for her, that's a very slippery slope to go down. And I
Hmm.
don't doubt that you treat your chickens well, but the problem is under the law, right? Chickens are considered property and they have no rights whatsoever anywhere. And so while you may, treat your chickens well, your neighbor may not, and
Hmm.
neighbor may then kill the chickens. But I think that it's different. Like I'm watching my friend's cat. I've been watching my friend's cat for the last year while they've been away in Europe, and I used a brush on this cat, long-haired cat, and I came up with like 10 tons of fur. I want to do a product placement here for a brush called the Furminator. Honestly, it's called the Furminator,
I love
and
it.
I've never seen anything like it. Now if I had taken that fur and made a little pillow out of it and sold it on Etsy, do I think that's unethical? No, I mean, because I was combing the cat to help her relieve her discomfort because she had too much fur. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
That's a byproduct. But it's not like I'm feeding and taking care of Fuzzy in order to the cat's name, in order to get something from her, because treating her like a thing. That's treating her instrumentally. And what does that mean? It's a fancy word, instrumentally. It means to exploit another being's helplessness or defenselessness or vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
You have power over the chickens, you know, and you're using that power in order to get something from them. Again, I'm not questioning that you're, sounds like you treat them really well, but um, the problem is the underlying relation of exploitation in the way we treat animals. And it's not, again, it's completely not necessary. So why do we do it? Why do we
Right.
persist?
Right. Now, if we wanted to, because of where we live up in the mountains above Santa Barbara, so you've got all kinds of birds flying over who are predators who would come down if we did not keep them protected within a fully enclosed, we'll call it a chicken wire run. They would come down, swoop down, and pick them up and take off, and they would kill them and eat them and so forth.
Yeah.
And yes, we do have them because we like the eggs, but but when they were not producing for several months, and people would say, "Well, do you eat them?" And I said, "No, no, they're as much our pets as the dogs and cats." All right, because and um, because they produce eggs, that's a byproduct of the fact that they're here. We would go into the chicken run when I had a much larger, about a 1,200 square foot chicken run, because we had 30 or 40 chickens, and we would sit in the chicken run on a little bench or chair. I'd have my beverage of choice and my wife hers, and we they would jump up on our knee. She even had one that jumped up on her head, and we would just be with them. I mean, again, because they were more like pets than anything else. It wasn't about the egg production, and but we wanted to make sure that they were safe.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things too that we did have a, I'll call it I call it the Great Chicken Massacre of 2012, December. I went out to check on the girls, and we also had a peahen who was sort of like the watchdog for the chickens. Every single chicken was dead, and there were several that had been disassembled because some critter had gotten in, and all of the other chickens just died. And I did not know that chickens could get so scared that they would die. And that
Yes.
was pretty horrific. So we didn't have chickens for quite a while. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting conversation. It's an interesting dynamic that we are dealing with here. And I certainly hope, folks, that you will get a copy of John's book. And again, it is called The Omnivore's Deception. It almost sounds like a mystery novel, you know,
It
with
is a mystery
detectives.
novel.
Well, in a sense, it is. Yes, what we get wrong about meat, animals, and ourselves. And is it true from your research, your study, and so forth, that we are not biologically carnivores, that we are actually herbivores by nature because of our teeth and digestive system?
No, I don't. I'm not convinced by those sorts of arguments. The main, at least, conventional scientific view, which has a lot to back it up, is that we are biologically omnivores. But unfortunately, people misunderstand what that means. They think that, well, because we can eat anything, including other animals, therefore it's natural and therefore it's right. It's completely ridiculous because humans have been eating other humans for thousands of years in many, many different cultures. Anthropophagy, as it's called, is common in many cultures historically. So if I go and kill my neighbor and the police get me and I say, well, I'm an omnivore, my body can metabolize, has been evolved to the point where it can metabolize human flesh. That's not a good, it's not going to stand up in court. Okay.
Right.
And many things that are natural are not good or right. Cancer and, as I said, bubonic plague and so forth are natural. But, human aggression may be natural. Psychologists debate that, but that's not a reason to encourage aggression. It means we need to watch out and, like, tame ourselves a bit, for
Yeah.
a stable society. So no, the evidence is that we're biological omnivores, but again, that simply means that we can eat just about anything. That doesn't mean that we should. I mean, we can also eat high fructose corn syrup. No, you know what I'm saying? Beverages
Yeah.
with
Hmm.
sugar. There, and so there's an is ought fallacy there. Like, okay, well, we can do it, therefore we should do it. Not so. Not so. We have a very clear choice, and then I argue in my books an existential choice. How do we want to be on this planet? Do we want to be the terror of the earth? Which, by the way, the Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish writer, she wrote this great book called "Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead," which is from a William Blake poem. I highly recommend that book. It basically depicts humans as the demon, the devil of the earth, in terms of how we treat other animals. Do we want to continue down that path of just participating in radical evil, or do we want to become an enlightened species with a civilization that treats others with a fundamental respect, with inviolability, where we don't wage war on one another, and wage war, by the way, on all the other creatures of the earth. We're killing off all the animals on the earth,
Yeah.
and why? We don't need to do it.
Yeah.
We shouldn't do it.
Well, that question always comes up in many, many of the conversations that I have with people. And that question is, just because we can, does that mean we should? Use CRISPR to get rid of sickle cell anemia. What do we know about the unintended consequences there? Different other medical procedures. How do we know that the what we've labeled as the coronavirus isn't an intelligent being? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have done what we did or we should have done. All I'm saying is, how do we know that we couldn't have communicated with it? Maybe it was an alien. It came from another world, kind of like in that movie Andromeda Strain, if you recall that one.
That's a great movie.
Yeah, it really is. We don't know at all what is and isn't intelligent, is and isn't sentient, and so on and so forth. And yet we take the position. That's why when I get into conversations with people, for example, about extraterrestrials, and then of course people will bring up the whole thing about how, oh, they're dangerous, and they're going to affect they're violating our national security, blah 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 blah. And I'm going, pal, if they can travel interstellarly, we wouldn't be having this conversation. They would have already taken over. Okay, so don't and this is those who do believe that we're not alone in the universe. Well, there is some truth to that. We are not, because we have all of these different creatures on this planet, and we need to learn to deal with them first. John, I want to thank you so much. We're going to take a quick pause here as we continue with our very special guest, author of the Omnivores, plural, Deception. John Sanbonmatsu is my guest here on Tell Me Your Story. This has been a fascinating conversation, John. I am really glad that I had you on the program. I want to ask you one other question here in regards to the interview itself. In regards to your own interest in this, when did this begin? You said you've been a vegan for 40 years. So it leads me to believe that this has been something of a concern of yours for more than 40 years.
Yeah, well, having grown up, as I said, with cats and dogs and seeing that they were individuals, I think that was really important for me in my background. And then coming across the philosopher Peter Singer's work. Now I'm a critic, actually, of Singer's work, but Peter Singer wrote this book, Animal Liberation, which was a very big bestseller in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
And that convinced me to become a vegetarian and then a vegan. But the thing is, honestly, I saw this as a personal issue for a long time. Like, I'm going to become a whatever. I'm not going to participate in this violence. And I could pat myself on the back and think, well, my job's done.
Mm-hmm.
But, having studied sociology and political science and philosophy, including ethics, I've come to believe that this is, as I said, the most important issue of our time. And it's not an individual issue. I mean, everybody, yeah, I urge people, absolutely, you should become a vegan. You just don't have any reason not to. And you have every reason to, morally and existentially. But this is a system that is so deeply rooted in our norms, our patterns of behavior, culture, modes of political economy, science, etc. That is the paradigm. When you talked about a paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote Structure of Scientific Revolutions in the early 1960s, describes a paradigm really as a way of seeing the world. And what he argues is that paradigms in science make it impossible for scientists to see outside of their way of seeing things. So if you believed in Newtonian physics, you didn't know what to make of relativity theory, or quantum mechanics. Like Newton would have, had a heart attack if he'd had to confront those kinds of things, probability theory or.
Yeah.
So look, it's not easy to see outside the paradigm that we're in, but it's essential to, and the kinds of critiques that I and others are making open a window. Look at it as if you like science fiction, it's a wormhole to another galaxy. Come
Hmm.
with us, because it's it's better on the other side. Trust me. We don't have to be up to our necks in blood and horror and evil. There's a better way to live.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And with your help and the help of many others, we're going to find those new ways of living because the old ways don't work. All you have to do is look around you, they do not work. And with that, I want to thank you for being a part of what we're doing. I do have three final questions that I ask all of my guests. Again, thank you for being here. This has just been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much. It has been. It's been. I really appreciate the questions you've brought to the table today.
Thank you. I do want to let you know that I thank you folks for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., Wednesdays at 9 a.m., and Monday through Friday from 8 to 9 a.m., streaming live at all those times at richarddugan.com. We're on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music. We are also on YouTube where you can watch these conversations. I hope you'll subscribe as well as click notification. I want to let you know too, you can go to Amazon.com to pick up my book, Choices, 5 Steps for Life. This is what we've been talking about. This entire program is about choices, making new choices, making choices that are more intelligent, more insightful, hopefully more inspired. We encourage you to do that. Get a copy at Amazon.com. It's in paperback, hardcover, and Kindle with Audible, soon to be released. And if you would like to leave us a tip, we would be gratefully appreciative. Our tip jar is called PayPal. So we have links on the homepage of richarddugan.com to Amazon and PayPal. And give what you can. We greatly appreciate it. And finally, when you have the time during this decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, take some time to go within to that quiet, peaceful, calm, still place and listen to that still small voice. To our guest, our very special guest, very interesting conversation. I don't think I've ever had one like this before, and I'm glad I have finally. We're going to ask the three questions, the first of which is, who is John Sabonmatsu?
Who is he? Gosh, I wish I knew. I mean, in ancient Greece, over the temple of Apollo were inscribed the words, "Know thyself." And people would go to the temple and they'd meet with the Delphic oracle, this woman who would kind of answer questions and from the gods, And I think it's really interesting. It's an interesting question. Who am I? I'm not even sure how to answer that. I'm many, many things. And I'm always like you and everybody else, a process. We're in process. We're trying, hopefully, to become better people. So that's what I guess I would say. I'm someone who's trying to be a better person every day.
Mm,
That's the nature of ethical virtue, is not being perfect because no one is, but really taking improvement of self and society seriously.
mm. What gets you up in the morning?
My coffee gets me up in the morning. Um, I'm only half kidding. What gets me up in the morning is my sense that we're running out of time on this earth, and that the suffering is unspeakable, it's indescribable, it's everywhere. The injustices are everywhere and growing.
Hmm.
I'm in Boston, and if it looks like I'm sweating, it's because I'm in an unair conditioned room, and it's supposed to hit almost 100 degrees today with
Oh,
70% humidity.
ouch.
And I'm from Massachusetts. I grew up here, and I can tell you we've never had a summer like this. Smashed all the records. We've had multiple heat waves. I mean, in Boston, like when I was growing up, you might get one heat wave a year where temperatures made it over 90, and now we've already had like 4 or 5 of those. And
Mm.
so it's really terrifying what's happening. So we all have to kind of stand up and get out of bed and put our shoulder to the wheel for
Mm.
just out of decency.
Yeah.
Have to do that.
And our final question is, what was your best day?
Um, Gosh, if I'd known these questions in advance, I definitely would have crammed for this exam. My best day, holy moly.
Hmm.
I guess the day my son was born. He turns 22, 22. Oh my God, 2023 in about a week, a little more than a week. So my son who lives in the Phoenix area. That was the best. That was the best day of my life. Yeah.
My hometown, so I know heat.
Really?
Yes, born and raised, spent 46 years there.
And that's why you're now in Santa Barbara. I get it.
Yes, although it gets warm here in the summertime too, although this year's been fairly mild. We've gone into the 80s, but for the most part, it still cools down into the 50s where we live. So I sympathize with your son, but I'm sure he's having a great time just the same. John,
Thank you.
thank you so much for being with us here on the program. This has been great, and I thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story. And until our next broadcast, podcast, video cast, love to all. Jeanette, I am still listening. Dad, continue to be happy because I am. Smokey, I'll see you on the other side. Mike, thanks for letting me be in your life. And to my dear friend Zorro, aho, aho.